Let's start with verse 43. We didn't really get everything covered with the Samaritan woman that I wanted to, but we got the gist of it and we've gotten some detail about some particulars. But we're going to go ahead and move on because this is going to be a long study anyway. But in John chapter 4, he's been there in Samaria. He dealt with the Samaritan woman and all those that came out to see him based on her word. And then remember verse 42 was an important one because they said, now we believe, not because what you told us, but because we've seen him, we know him, we've heard him, and so we believe based on what he says and does. Now watch verse 43. Now after the 2 days he departed from there and went to Galilee, for Jesus himself testified that a prophet has no honor in his own country. And so when he came to Galilee, the Galileans received him, having seen all the things he did in Jerusalem at the feast, for they also had gone to the feast. So in our map here, we're going to get a better look here at the next slide. But remember, he was down here in Judea. Then he went up through Samaria. And now he goes up to Galilee. But he bypasses his hometown of Nazareth. Now, it's interesting that he does this because we're going to see Cana on the next one. It's in the vicinity. And if you had been down in this area for quite a while and you got the chance to go home, what would you do as you're going through the area? Yeah, you'd go spend the night with mom and see how mom and them are doing and spend some time with the people there. But Jesus, instead of going to Nazareth, he goes to Galilee. And I think the reason that we see that is because of verse 44. For Jesus himself testified that a prophet has no honor in his own country. That could be either talking about Nazareth or it could be talking about Galilee. I believe it's talking about Nazareth. He bypasses Nazareth to go to Cana instead. Why? Well, because a prophet has no honor in his own country. But news travels fast. And people were already well informed about him when they arrived in verse 45, as we saw. But he goes to Cana. What did he already do in Cana? That's where he performed his first miracle, right? He turned the water into wine. Nazareth is where he grew up. That's where people would look at him. How do you think that they would look at Jesus, those people who knew him his entire life? What do you think? He didn't perform any miracles growing up that are recorded. So how would they look at Jesus? Yeah. It's not the carpenter's son. Even his brothers, his brother Mosier said, they thought of him as just another person, not the Son of God. Because even his brethren didn't believe in him. That phrase, a prophet is without honor in his own country. I want you to think about that. And why do you think that's true? Because they know you. How about if you are like Jesus, an exceptional person? There's still something there because they know you. Let me tell you, and all the preachers in here will understand, you preaching students will understand this before long. If you really want to be appreciated as a preacher, go somewhere else and preach. Go somewhere else and preach, because even though they have a preacher that you would love to be able to preach as well as, when you get there, oh boy, we've never heard preaching like that. And then you go home. Oh, Mark's back. And then that preacher where you were, he comes to where you are now, and it's like, oh man, this is just the greatest preaching we've ever heard. Now, all things are not equal there, but that's kind of how it is. We get used to things, don't we? We get used to things. The sad thing is, Nazareth didn't appreciate what they had, did they? I'm not talking about preachers anymore. I'm talking about Jesus. They didn't appreciate what they had in Jesus. And that's really going to come to light in especially next week's lesson. But he bypasses Nazareth at this time. Now, I want you to notice some things as we look at John chapter 4. Let's go ahead and read the text. Then I'm going to show you a map, and we're going to make some application here. Look at verse 46. So Jesus came again to Cana of Galilee, where he had made the water wine. And there was a certain nobleman whose son was sick at Capernaum. When he heard that Jesus had come out of Judea into Galilee, he went to him and implored him to come down and heal his son, for he was at the point of death. Then Jesus said to him, "Unless you people see signs and wonders, you will by no means believe." The nobleman said to him, "Sir, come down before my child dies." Jesus said to him, "Go your way, your son lives." So the man believed the word that Jesus spoke to him, and he went his way. And as he was now going down, his servants met him and told him, saying, "Your son lives." Then he inquired of them the hour when he got better, and they say to him, "Yesterday at the 7th hour the fever left him." And the father knew that it was at the same hour in which Jesus said to him, "Your son lives," and he himself believed, and his whole household. This again is the second sign Jesus did when he had come out of Judea into Galilee. All right, now let's just think about this. Capernaum to Galilee, that means, or Capernaum to Cana means nothing to us really unless we dig just a little bit deeper. Remember what we said at the beginning of this class? We're going to look at three things. And I'm going to continue to bring this up because in your Bible study, this is easy to do just by just a little extra research, just a little extra work that you can find in most Bible dictionaries, Bible geography books. It doesn't take much to do this, but how much more it adds to the account as you study it. Remember, there was three things we were going to talk about. Culture was one. We talked about that with the Samaritan woman. That really came into play. And then we talked about history, and I think that's why it's so important to talk about the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Their history, not just what we read. How did they get to where they were, spiritually speaking, when Jesus was on the earth? And then we look at Bible geography. Those three things, history, culture, and Bible geography. So let's just look at Bible geography. This man comes from Capernaum, and he comes to Cana. And now let's look at this. This is a topographical map. Shows hills, shows elevation. And so here I've got this hand. Ignore that red thing. I couldn't figure out how to get that off of there today. That's not it. But it's right here's Capernaum. And you notice it's on the north coast of the Sea of Galilee. And then all the way over here is Cana. That line didn't connect for some reason. But it goes from here to there. And notice Cana is 2,849 feet above sea level. 2,849 feet above sea level. So it's up. And it comes out in the text that we just read. Capernaum, as we've said, is on the northwest shore of the Sea of Galilee, which is 682 feet below sea level. So somebody who's good at math, and a good teacher would have figured this out before he got here. From 682 below sea level to 2,849 feet above sea level. So from Capernaum to Cana, how is he going the entire time? 3,500 feet up. 3,500 feet up. Has anybody ever climbed 3,500 feet? I did. It wasn't fun. I did once. Has anybody ever done any running? Is it easier to run? I know everybody knows this question, whether we've been a runner or not. Is it easier to run on flat ground or uphill? We know the answer, don't we? But see, watch what this does. It paints a picture. It's about 20 miles from each other. So this father basically runs nearly a marathon uphill to get to Jesus. Well, he's coming from Capernaum up to Cana. Yeah, to Cana. He'll get to go downhill on the way home. So about 20 miles, he's going up. Now, Is there any parent here who wouldn't try to do the same thing for their sick child? Now, of course, we get that. I want you to read this description. This is from R.C. Foster. I've quoted him a few times. Let me read this. Before you do, let me make sure you get what I'm saying here. 3,500 feet, 20 miles uphill, because the son is dying. All right? That's Bible geography. That's interesting to know, isn't it? And then this quote. It was a long, difficult journey under such circumstances from Capernaum to Cana. What a wild beating this man's heart made at the gates of his soul as he climbed mountain trails or grimly plodded up the highway. Was it through the long hours of the night that he toiled up from the Sea of Galilee to the crest of the mountain range? This seems to be true, for he arrived in the daytime, and a time when Jesus was surrounded by a listening multitude. Now, let's read the text again, just with that knowledge. Let's pick up on some things here, and I'll emphasize it. So Jesus came again to Cana of Galilee. How far is Cana above sea level? All right, 28:49. Where he made the water wine, and there was a certain nobleman whose son was sick at Capernaum. When he heard that Jesus had come out of Judea into Galilee, he went to him and implored him to come, what's that next word? Down and heal his son. Let's go back and look at this map. Come down. It's actually a little bit north. So when he says come down, what's he talking about? Elevation, isn't he? Come down and heal his son, for he was at the point of death. Then Jesus said to him, unless you people see signs and wonders, you will by no means believe. The nobleman said to him, Sir, come down before my child dies. Jesus said to him, Go your way, your son lives. Can you just see some things in there? If he started out in the middle of the night, and we don't know exactly when he left. Maybe he left when he heard that Jesus was coming out of Samaria or whatever. But whatever the case, whenever he left, those 20 miles that he went, why did he do that? Because he was desperate. He was desperate. Desperation is what drove him to do that. Come down, or my son is going to die. Come down before he dies. Notice some traits about the nobleman, and then we'll look a little bit deeper here. Number one, he possessed faith. Already he possessed faith. You don't run 20 miles uphill because you don't believe the one you're going to seek. Can't do something about it. His faith would grow from that as a grain of a mustard seed to full faith in Christ. His faith moved him to seek the help of Jesus. He took it upon himself to come to Jesus personally rather than to send someone else. Now, he was a nobleman. You think you would typically, if you were a nobleman and going to run an errand, you would make the 20-mile trek uphill yourself, or would you send somebody else to do it? Why do you think he does it himself? His son. While he may have believed that Jesus could heal his son, he had no idea he could do it from a distance. What's he begging him to do? You got to come down. My son's dying. You've got to come now. And he thought it would be too late once the child had died. So he went to him and implored him to come down. Now, it's interesting what Jesus says. What's the first thing that Jesus says to him when the man from Capernaum, the nobleman, when he implores him to come down and heal his son, for he was at the point of the death? What does Jesus say? He tested him. He said, unless you people see signs and wonders, you will by no means believe. Now, some people will say, well, Jesus was addressing the multitude, but look at the text. Jesus said to him. Now, I believe the multitude could hear him, but who's he talking to? He's talking to this man. Unless you people see signs and wonders, you will by no means believe. Perhaps this is to lead him to a greater faith. And that faith would grow. It would grow from that of a mustard seed to a full faith in Christ. Does this man simply say, okay, you got me? No, what does he say? He's persistent. He says, sir, come down before my child dies. Yeah. Brother Mosier said, does that not remind you of the Syrophoenician woman a little bit? She wouldn't give up either. And this just paints a picture in my mind, and that's one of the reasons I love the book of John especially, is because I can see this, I can understand this, I can understand the desperation in a certain way. I've never been in this situation, but you know, those of us for a loved one, there's nothing we wouldn't do to try to help them, right? And so we get that. We see his desperation. But then Jesus said to him, you know, him thinking it's going to be too late if he dies before Jesus gets there. He says, come down before my child dies. Now, he's already had one test. And that test was what? We just talked about it. Right. You people, unless you see signs and wonders, you're not going to believe. Now we know how this ends because we just read it. Did Jesus know this man's heart? John has already told us a couple of times. Jesus knew it was in the heart of man. Jesus knew this man. He's testing him. But then he goes a little bit further. And this is where I fall in love with this man even more. When Jesus says to him, when you think one way all of your life, and then you hear about Jesus, and then you begin to think that way, and it's hard not to do this. You hear one thing, and what do we automatically start doing? We start making our own conclusions about whatever it is. You see a news report on television, you start making your own conclusions. You do that in your mind, and we do that sometimes before we have all of the facts. So this man comes to Jesus, and what is his begging? Come down before my son dies. What's this man, what conclusion has he reached in his mind? In order for Jesus to heal his son, what does Jesus have to do? You've got to go with me. We got to go now. And then you think about this. If you had just come 20 miles, and I have an idea he wasn't crawling, I have an idea he was going as fast as his body would let him go. And then to turn around and want to make, and you might say, well, it's all downhill from there. Well, yeah. It's 20 miles though.
Still 20 miles.
But you make conclusions in your mind. And this man has already concluded that unless Jesus comes down, my son is going to die. And so this test, go your way, your son lives. Right. I'm not going to ask you what you would do because I don't want you to have to tell on yourself. But I can say this, and I think I can say it rather confidently. Wouldn't that be hard to do? With your biases, with your preconceived notions, wouldn't that be hard to do? Now, the days of miracles have ceased, we understand that, and I'll never be faced with a situation like this. I won't. Jesus is at the right hand of God. Now I can pray and I can pray and I can pray, but I won't have to run 20 miles to Capernaum to get physical Jesus to come to Cana, to get Jesus to come to Capernaum. However, we are raised in life, we have preconceived ideas in our mind. All of us do. And the Bible will challenge us at times, those preconceived notions that we have. Well, my mom always said, my dad always said, my preacher always said, my wife always said, well, I've always believed. I'll never have to go through exactly what this man went through, but I go through something very similar. When the Bible disagrees with what I've always believed, what will you do in that situation? That's something to think about, isn't it? And it's not just for people outside of the church. It's not just for non-Christian. It's not for people outside of the church. That's for me. As I read this account, that's for me. That's for all of us, isn't it? And so, go your way, your son lives. And then watch this. This is what I love about this man. So the man believed the word that Jesus spoke to him, and he went his way. Now logically, and either this man came to it right away in his mind, or he did it just because he believed so much in Jesus at that point. But logically, if a man can touch somebody and completely remove all sickness, if he can just, by the name, of course he hasn't done it yet at this point in the book of John, but just the words, call somebody out of the grave, logically, if a man can do that, is 20 miles anything to him? No. But my point is, this man wasn't thinking that way. He wasn't thinking that way. And so what does he do? He believes. He believes. So the man believed the word that Jesus spoke to him, and he went his way. Right, and he is going downhill. He starts going back down to Capernaum. And then verse 51. And as he was now going down, his servants met him and told him, saying, your son lives. And watch how the Bible clarifies things. And in this man's mind, you might think, well, man, this guy had just such great faith. He had the faith to go and look for Jesus. He had the faith to ask Jesus to come down. Then he had the faith to leave this man. But I want you to notice, it was not just a blind faith. This man investigates this. Watch. As he was now going down, his servants met him and told him, saying, your son lives. Now picture that in your mind. As the servants come to meet him, he's going home. They meet there on the road. Do you think this was a very solemn, oh, we want you to know maybe your son, he's alive and he's going to be just fine. You think it went like that? Your son lives. And keep in mind, this is not a parable. This actually happened. All right? And so he doesn't just say, oh, it's a miracle, everything's great. And keep in mind, he's believing this whole time, but watch how his faith grows. And so your son lives. Verse 52, then he inquired of them the hour when he got better. Now, why did he do that? This is not blind faith. I'm continuing my investigation in this. If you compare this to all the modern day so-called faith healers, there's nothing in common at all. What time did it happen? And they said to him, yesterday at the 7th hour, the fever left him. Verse 53, so the father knew that it was at the same hour in which Jesus said to him, your son lives. So the 7th hour, if we're counting by Jewish time, which they would have been, what time is that? 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So that's how we know when he was talking to Jesus, that's what time the fever left him. And so this walk, right, whole day later. That's right, 20 miles. Has anybody ever walked 20 miles in here? You have, Bob? At one time? Woo! in the army. He said, yeah, that might be the only way I would ever do it. Yeah, the first. It looks like it could. It looks like he was by himself, but you've got people there tending to his son, and all of these things, and it doesn't tell us everything. They meet. He asks what time. They say the 7th hour, and then he believes. So the rest of that walk, wherever they met, can you imagine that conversation as you go back together? Guys, let me tell you, you're not going to believe this, but I promise you it's true. It was at exactly the 7th hour when Jesus, who I was begging to come with me, said, you go your way, your son lives. I believed, I went. And now you're telling me it was exactly the 7th hour that the fever left him. Yeah. Brother Mosier says, of course, he kept that, facetiously said he kept that information to himself. He wouldn't have told anybody. And we know he's kidding because look at verse 53. So the father knew that it was at the same hour in which Jesus said to him, your son lives, and he himself believed, and watch, and his whole household, his whole family did. Those servants, his whole household. Faith and action. He believed and went. He believed and he went. Here's some points to consider about this great passage. So far, we've had 3 individual interactions. You have Nicodemus, and this comes from Brother Waycaster's book, this part of it does. You have the 3 interviews with Jesus and Jesus' ministry so far. You have Nicodemus, a cautious venture of a learned inquirer. What sect of the Jews did Nicodemus belong to? Right, he was a Pharisee, wasn't he? And he was high up with that. And so you have the cautious venture of a learned inquirer. The second type of faith was a wistful yearning brought to light only by persistence on Jesus' part to get to the heart of the Samaritan woman. She wasn't even inquiring at the beginning, was she? Jesus initiated that. Now, she asked some questions later on, but Jesus is the one that started that. And then this third type of faith was the result of desperation to exercise faith as the lesser difficulty of a hard choice. The lesser difficulty of a hard choice. What type of person is not able to obey the gospel? It's a trick question and not worded well. Let me just ask it more plainly. Is there any type of person, a learned one who carefully investigates, can he obey the gospel? How about someone who really shows no interest, but then hears it and then believes? Can that type of person obey the gospel? And then what about somebody who comes in desperation? Can that type of person obey the gospel? Now, I'm not going to ask again anybody to raise their hand, but we probably have all 3 of those types of people in this building tonight, somewhere or another. Which one's more of a Christian? All of them. And I tell you something, it's interesting to see how people come to believe in Jesus Christ, and I love to listen to people talk about it. There was a young man, if I mentioned his name, some of you would know him, so I won't, but his mother was an erring member of where I used to preach, and she was dying of cancer. She pulled a muscle in her back, putting up Christmas decorations, went to her chiropractor. Her chiropractor took an x-ray, said, you need to go see your doctor immediately, today. And found out she had cancer and she would be gone within 2 weeks. And so she had a son that was in high school and spent a lot of time there throughout those 2 weeks. And the mother was restored in the hospital bed. And this young man who had never been to a worship service or a Bible study in his life, he asked me the question while we were in there visiting. He said, Mark, do you think when all this is over we can get together and study? And I said, absolutely, absolutely. And it was a few days, I was going to give him some time, a few days after the funeral. He said, Mark, is that offer to study still good? I said, absolutely. So we started studying. He obeyed the gospel. And not only that, but he's a gospel preacher. And he is just one of the best hearts of anybody you would ever want to meet. And if not for desperation in his life at that point, you wonder. You wonder. So I say all that to say this. Let's not give up on people. And don't think, well, he's too smart. He's too learned. He wouldn't be interested. Or that person, man, they are so like the Samaritan woman, such of ill repute. I know they won't be interested. In those times of desperation. All right, I got to go on. I've got 2 minutes left. The rich have afflictions as well as the poor. We've seen that in this nobleman, haven't we? Sickness and death come to the young as well as the old. When we were young, what did we think? And we're going to live forever. There's nothing that can stop me. Now, I always make sure I look down when I'm going down a step. I watch these kids up here jumping off that top step, and I want to try it so badly. But I'm afraid I'd end up in that third pew. Momentum is a hard thing to stop, isn't it? But young people can face sickness and death just as well as the old. And then the last one, and I love this. Christ's word is just as good as his presence. Isn't that good? Right. Right. But at his word, that's right. And the point I want to make with that is sometimes we lament, oh, I wish I could have seen this. I wish I could have been there. I wish I could have lived in that day. And I have to admit, I do too. However, when we read the words of Jesus, we see him. We see his power. We see the healing. We see the salvation that comes through his word. We see him, don't we? And it's just as powerful as his presence. 2 miracles so far in the book of John. And you've probably heard this before, and it's a great thing to think about. When he turned the water into wine, what did the master of the ceremony, what did he say about the wine? It was the best. Quality. It's the best. And so he is the master of quality, and he's the master of distance too, isn't he? And aren't you glad that Jesus had to be standing right next to me to heal me? All right, next week we're going to talk about his rejection in Nazareth. And you can study that. And the following week we'll be talking about the Pharisees and the Sadducees.